Well, hello again everybody and welcome to another episode. I think mirrorless cameras are one of the greatest advances in photography in decades, but new ones are really expensive, between £1,000 and £2,000, quite a lot of them. However, they've been around long enough now that some real bargains are emerging, and today we're going to have a look at one of the nicest, possibly the nicest, older mirrorless camera you can buy. It's this one. It's the Fujifilm X-T1, and this is a wonderful little camera, and it was pretty much a game changer when it came out. This camera was introduced in 2014, so it's not new by any means. In fact, it's around 6 or 7 years old. It's got a 16.3 megapixel APS-C X-Trans 2 sensor with no AA filter in front of it for sharper images. It's got a magnesium body, it's weather sealed, and it's got the beautiful Fujifilm simulations, which I absolutely adore. So this is a very well-specced, very capable little camera. 16 megapixels is not a great deal by today's standards, but between you and me, unless you're blowing up to enormous proportions, you don't really need any more than 5 megapixels. The sensor is still held in very high regard. This camera's sensor is often said to be rather better than that in the X-T2 and some of the subsequent models. What's for sure is it makes absolutely beautiful images. I must say I particularly like this camera. This is a camera I can really bond with, and I don't know, maybe that sounds a bit odd, but I do find that with any machinery, whether it's a car or a camera or anything else, you do have to be able to establish some sort of rapport with it. You do have to have that bond with it, and this is a camera that I can very, very easily bond with. It's made to reproduce the look of a film camera and the feel of using a film camera, and I think it really succeeds in that regard. Now, I recently reviewed its little brother, the X-T10, which is essentially a cut-down version of the same camera. This is the X-T10 over here, and it's essentially, well, it's certainly a very similar camera. It has all of the same electronic parts, it has the same sensor, it has the same processing software, it has the same menus, and it's very, very similar in all respects. However, when I used the X-T10, I did find myself a little bit underwhelmed by it. Now, the X-T10 here is a lovely little camera, absolutely. There's nothing wrong with this camera at all, but I just couldn't bond with it. This, on the other hand, is different. The X-T10 is a very, very nice little camera and a very capable little camera. The X-T1 is, at least for me, an object of desire. So how does that happen? How do two very similar cameras with the same sensor, the same circuitry, the same film simulations, and many of the same controls, how does that experience of using them feel so different when they are actually so similar? Well, the differences between them are actually really small, but I can tell you they do add up to quite a difference. And this camera, the X-T1, really feels much more of a film experience. It really does feel like using an old film SLR. So there is the camera, and there is our top deck. Now, anybody who's used a film camera will be right at home with this one. So from the right, your left, we've got the exposure compensation dial, which gives us 3 stops of exposure up and down. Then we've got the shutter speed dial, and it's got a lock at the auto position. This little button here, you have to press it, and you can then move the dial out of auto, but once it goes back into auto, then it's stuck there. A lot of film cameras had that feature. Certainly the later Pentax film cameras had that feature. It's got B and T settings. I don't know if you can see them there, just around here, which is very unusual in a modern camera. Certainly the T setting is. Those are very useful for astrophotography or light painting, anywhere where you want to keep the shutter open. At the farther end, we've got an ISO dial. How wonderful is that? Look at this ISO dial. It's got a lock for the auto position, the same as the shutter speed dial has. In fact, I think it's got a lock for every position. Yes, it does. It locks in every position. You've got to push that button down and change it like that. So that's very reminiscent of the old film cameras. And you can see that generally this is made very much to resemble one of the classic SLRs of the past. Now that ISO dial means that you don't have to go diving into menus whenever you want to change the value. Now if we compare the two top plates, we can see that where the X-T1 has an ISO dial, the X-T10 has a bracketing control, and it's this simple change more than anything else. It may sound ridiculous, but this simple change more than anything else changes the feel and character of this camera. It adds up to a much nicer experience. Not that the X-T10 is a bad camera, but the X-T1 is just that bit nicer. It has a far better viewfinder too. Unfortunately, I can't actually shoot into the viewfinder and show you, but I can tell you the viewfinder itself has several different settings, well, 3 different settings. It's very, very large, and you can use the whole of the area of the viewfinder to see your shot, or you can choose to have it that little bit smaller with information displayed, or you can choose to have a dual display which shows you the main scene, the whole of the main scene as you normally would get in a viewfinder, but right next to that, right where the centre of the shot is, right on your focus point, there is a pre-zoomed window. So you've got the ordinary shot over here, and right next to it you've got the centre of the shot magnified several times to aid focusing. And that's a really, really good thing, and it lifts this camera from a pretty nice mirrorless to a really, really capable tool. That one feature means that focusing is far easier on this camera than it is on this camera. Both cameras have peaking, but the peaking isn't that prominent, and even when peaking is prominent, you can't always get it absolutely spot on. Sometimes you're a little bit too long, sometimes you're a little bit too short, and it's hard to get. But with that magnification in the viewfinder, you're going to get pretty much spot on focus every time. It's as good as the old split prisms that the film SLRs used to have, that invaluable focusing aid that has disappeared apparently for good. This system is a really credible replacement for that prism that's been lost. So absolute top marks to Fuji. Those 2 small changes, the ISO dial and the viewfinder changes, make this into a vastly more capable, vastly more likeable, in my opinion, camera than the X-T10 is. Now, because this is a mirrorless camera, it will of course shoot pretty much any lens that's ever been made. There are some exceptions, but the vast array of lenses you can shoot with any mirrorless camera. And I found it really works nicely with the old lenses I've been using. I'll tell you which lenses I've been using. This lens, the Helios 40, this is one of my favourite lenses. I have talked about it several times. I've occasionally thought about selling it, but it's just too nice. And the other day I went out with it on the Fuji. Most of the character I found was preserved. Don't forget, this is a crop sensor camera, which means that roughly the outside third edge of the frame is lost because the sensor is smaller and its field of view is narrower for a given lens. So I wasn't entirely sure if the character of the Helios would come through, but as you can see from these images, it has. These images could not have been made by any other lens. They are unique. The Helios has put its stamp on them, and there's no problem with shooting this lens or other older lenses on this crop sensor camera. You can see all the famous swirly background blur that the Helios is famous for. You can see all the little bubbles from point light sources that it's famous for, and it just has that beautiful, beautiful look, which I'm glad to say comes through undiminished on this APS-C sensor camera, even though we lose the edges of the frame as compared to full frame. I've also shot on it the Zeiss Jena Pancolar 50mm 1.8, one of my favourite lenses. Made some very nice shots with that, and I've been using the Zeiss Jena wider lens, the 29mm f2.8 lens. Now, I had heard that this lens was not quite up to the usual Zeiss Jena standards, which were absolutely phenomenal. They're some of the best of the older lenses. They have something of a reputation because they were made in the old East Germany, and there was always a little bit of kickback because of the political situation and so on. But take it from me, these are lovely lenses. It's very sharp, it's got the nice Zeiss Jena colours, and it works really nicely on the X-T1, where it gives a focal length equal to, on full frame, around about 40mm. So 28-29mm is a great lens. If you've got an APS-C sensor camera, 28-29mm is a great lens for street photography because it gives you that 40mm equivalent. Now, I also shot the Helios 28mm lens on the X-T1. It's sitting on the X-T10 at the moment. By the way, both these lenses, the Helios 28 and the Zeiss Jena 29, were lent to me by viewer Mark Murphy, so many thanks for the loan, Mark. You'll be glad to hear your lenses worked very nicely on the Fuji cameras. The Helios lens, however, I must admit I was a little overwhelmed by this lens. It doesn't have the sharpness of the Zeiss Jena. The colours are very nice, but I don't know. It's a nice little lens, but it didn't seem to measure up to the Zeiss Jena to me, although it's certainly usable and workable, but it doesn't have that Zeiss Jena magic. Now, as well as the vintage lenses, there are loads of modern Fuji X-mount lenses, both from Fujifilm and third-party lenses, and when I bought this camera, I got one of them. It's the Fujifilm X-C 15 to 45mm, 3.5 to 5.6. Now, this isn't the lens that originally came with this camera. I think this is from one of the other Fuji cameras. And at first glance, I thought, well, this is a little underwhelming. It's a, cheap kit lens. Yes, it is a cheap kit lens, but it's a jolly good cheap kit lens. This is a really, really nice lens. It's very sharp. Full frame equivalent focal lengths are around about 23mm at the wide end to about, let me think, around about 70 at the long end. So you've got a 23 to 70mm zoom there, and that will cover a lot of photographic eventualities. That's a very, very nice little short zoom. It's got really nice colour. It's very, very sharp indeed. It has a little bit of fringing in the corners sometimes, but to be honest, that really doesn't bother me too much. It focuses very, very quickly. You're not going to get a great deal of blur out of it because it's a fairly short lens on a crop sensor body, and it doesn't have a terribly wide aperture, but you can get some if you're close to your subject. Let me show you the lens in a little more detail. So there is our lens, and it's a lovely little thing. And it's actually got manual controls on it as well. You can see it's got two rings there. This one, the front one, is a focus ring. There are no mechanical connections at all in this lens. It's all electronic, so when you're turning the focus ring, all you're doing is turning an electrical control. But when you switch to manual focus, as I've actually got it on now. This is the focus mode switch here. When you switch to manual focus, you can actually focus this lens manually if you want to by using that ring, though it's so quick to focus that I can't think of any situation where I would choose to focus manually with this lens. The second ring is a zoom ring, so this has an electrical zoom. Let me switch it on and show you. I'll put the battery in first, that's always a good idea. This battery lasts very well. It does about 300 shots. I had no problems using it for a day. So now I'm going to switch the camera on. It's quite an extender. So there's the focus ring, the zoom ring. And here's the focus ring. You can hear the zoom ring operating, but you can't actually hear the focus ring operating. So we turn it off, and there the lens folds back. Now, one of the biggest selling points with the Fuji cameras is the Fujifilm simulations, and they've proved extremely popular, and I'm really not surprised. They are absolutely exquisite. There are not as many on this one as on later models. This one has the same film sims as the X-T10, so we have ones like Provia, Velvia, there's one called Classic Chrome. They're mostly replicas of the looks of Fujifilm stocks of the past. Classic Chrome isn't. Classic Chrome is an attempt to make an image that looks like sort of a 70s magazine, an image that's gone through the magazine print process, and it's very, very successful at doing that. The black and whites are less successful, I think, but if you play around a little bit with the shadow and highlight controls and change the levels within your black and white shot, they can become very punchy, very intense, and you can cook your own film stocks essentially on your camera. And you can save them on the camera too, which is fantastic. And if you go over to the website fujiweekly.com, you'll find loads of recipes for these Fuji cameras, loads of film recipes that the guy who runs the site has worked on and has produced. So there are a lot of extra looks that you can get for both the X-T1 and the X-T10, and indeed all the other Fuji cameras as well. These film simulations absolutely make these cameras, and I think they're the best thing that's come to digital photography in a long, long time. Now, it's often said that video on these cameras isn't that great, and I must admit it's not quite as good as other mirrorless cameras that I've used, and perhaps that's not entirely surprising because Fujifilm's background is in still cameras and in film. They've never been manufacturers of video cameras, and I don't suppose at this time the skills were there for them to produce the very best video. There was an update for the video capabilities in, I think, 2015. Quite early on there was an update. When this camera was first produced, it could shoot only in 60p, that is 60 frames per second progressive scan. And the video from that, I've got to admit, is pretty awful. It's plagued by jaggies and straggly things and artifacts that just appear. It's really strange. I've never seen video like it. It's lovely and smooth because of the 60 frames per second, but my goodness, the artifacts are bad, and I'm quite surprised this camera was released with video that bad. However, the update did do a lot to fix things. The update brought the ability to shoot at 24 frames per second, and if you select that option, P, it has to be 24p progressive, otherwise you'll get strange artifacts if you shoot any of the eye options. So stick to P, but if you shoot 24p or 25p, or I think 30p if you're in the USA, because the line standard is a little different, you will not get hardly so many problems. The video is of much higher quality. It's still not perfect, it's still not good as video from, say, the A6000, and you can see here that there's some strobing from some of the lights. So I should have shot this at 1/50th of a second shutter speed to match the mains frequency, so I wouldn't have got any strobing. So I think that's my fault. You can see on the traffic lights also in 60p, it looks like low-res digitization if you look carefully at it, but on 24p that's gone. So the video is much nicer shot on 24p, 25p or 30p, and frankly I wouldn't use this camera to shoot a movie or a short or even a music video, any professional footage really. You might get away with it as a B-roll camera if you use it carefully, but it's certainly nice for things like holidays, days out, you know, day-to-day sort of video, and you can shoot the video in the film simulations, and that is just amazing. So that's the Fujifilm X-T1. These cameras are absolutely beautiful. If you like using film camera type controls, they're a real breeze to use. They're very simple and they really make the experience of using this camera feel really tight and together, and you can really bond with this machine in a way that I just couldn't quite with the X-T10, despite how nice it is. Do I keep this X-T1? I'm very tempted to. This is quite a special X-T1. When I got it, it had 27 shutter actuations. It came with this lovely little lens. It's a beautiful little camera. It's in perfect, pretty much condition. I'm very much inclined to keep it. Let me know what you would do. It cost me £300 for basically a new X-T1. Let me know what you would do. If you want to buy one of these, there's loads of them around. There is absolutely no shortage of good ones, and a really nice one, really nice, will cost you anywhere from £250 to £300. These are lovely little cameras. They're cheap, they're available, they're out there, and they're absolutely fantastic to use. You will not regret getting one of these cameras and using it. Just beautiful. So that's it from me for now. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that bell before you go. And if you like the content on this channel and you'd like to help it grow and develop, you can do that over at patreon.com/Zenography. As ever, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time for some more Zenography.